The Kremlin routinely lies about its war and its money. Putin claims that the Russian economy is expanding, but the numbers point towards crisis. Officials insist that the situation inside of Russia is stable, but signs of internal turmoil are continuing to grow. Now, a Russian general has admitted this war itself began with a lie. On state television, a former commander of Russia's ground forces stated that the intelligence services told the Kremlin that 70% of Ukrainians would welcome a pro Moscow regime change. That reality was quite the opposite. That lie turned a 3-day planned special military operation into a grinding war that is bleeding Russia's soldiers, its budget, and its stability. A war built on a lie always sends the bill to its own people. At the same time, the financial engine of this war is misfiring. Russia's biggest oil producers have seen profits collapse by almost 80%. Shadow fleet oil tankers linked to Russian exports have been hit and crippled at sea. Major Russian banks in Moscow are loaded with bad loans that would set off alarms in a normal country. Ordinary Russians are pulling billions of dollars in cash out of their bank accounts and hiding it at home while the Kremlin borrows on a wartime scale just to keep the system moving. Today, inside this crisis, is one region that matters more than the others. In Russia's south, a small Muslim republic about the size of Connecticut is run as a personal strongman state that lives on federal money from Moscow. That region is Chechnya. But now, Ukrainian drones are striking in and around its capital. The money that buys its loyalty is shrinking, and the war that began with an intelligence lie is starting to threaten the system that holds Russia together. All of this comes from the lies catching up with the Kremlin. As Alexander Solzhenitsyn once said, the Soviet Kremlin that they are lying, they know that everyone else knows that they are lying, and still they continue to lie. In Russia, the truth arrives late and arrives with a bill that the regime can no longer afford. My name is Jason Smart. I'm a special correspondent for the Kyiv Post and National Security Advisor. The situation in Russia is becoming very complicated. Let's take a look at what's happening. Let's take a look at inside the Russia right now, what we see, because this is a situation that's far different than what you see in the news. Because inside of Russia, a southern strongman state is becoming a new front in this war. This vulnerability now threatens the regime more than any NATO missile or frontline defeat could. If a drone hits a tower in Moscow, the government replaces the glass and falsifies the news reports. But if a drone appears over the strongman state in the south, the shock reaches the foundations of the federal state. This region is the place where the Russian army was humiliated in the 1990s and where the current dictatorship was built in the 2000s. Ukrainian strikes are now reaching the networks that keep Putin's strongmen in power. Reports of drones and deep strikes toward the southern mountains mark a strategic shift in the war. The message is that even the most heavily subsidized, heavily armed regions, they are no longer safe zones. They are strike zones. A tribute state that once looked untouchable now looks exposed, appearing on the same target map as burning refineries and depots. And at the same time, new figures from Ukraine's commander-in-chief reveal the scale of attrition. General Alexander Syrsky reports that Russia has deployed more than 710,000 troops along the active front line. Those forces are losing between 1,000 and 1,100 soldiers every single day. Most of them are killed in action. A war planned as a quick operation based on a 70% support lie has become a meat grinder that is devouring brigades, budgets, and political legitimacy. But inside of Russia, the realization of this failure is becoming impossible to hide. The admission by General Churkin regarding this intelligence failure confirms the structural rot. A state that believed it was marching into a friendly country trapped itself in a hostile war of attrition, and today that air has drained the resources needed to maintain the delicate balance of power inside of the Russian Federation. Three crises now converge on the same fault line: a military bleeding manpower based on strategic fantasy, an economy hit by a liquidity crisis, collapsing oil profits, and capital flight, and a political bargain with the southern strongman that depends entirely on federal money that is no longer flowing freely. Ukraine's deep strikes and Western pressure, they're targeting these exact weak points. Refineries are hit, shadow fleet tankers explode, and the war machine loses the cash that keeps the enforcers loyal. Every drone over the south and every bank wobble increases the cost of holding the Russian Federation together. Destabilization requires severing the financial lifelines They keep the strongmen paid and the banks afloat. A war that began with a lie now lives on borrowed money and on borrowed time. This strongman state runs on tribute, not a real economy. To understand why this financial pressure is so dangerous, it is necessary to see how this region operates. So the First Chechen War in the 1990s broke the illusion of Russian military power. A small mountainous republic resisted a much larger force, destroying tank columns in the streets of the capital. The defeat, it accelerated the collapse of the old Russian leadership and exposed the weaknesses of the center. The Second Chechen War, it turned military conquest into a financial transaction with the local ruling clan. And when the current power regime rose to power, it made this region a signature project. The capital was flattened and destroyed by the Russian military. Resistance was crushed, and the Kadyrov family was installed as the ruling dynasty. First, there was Akhmat Kadyrov, and then his son, who is the current dictator, Ramzan Kadyrov. They accepted the role of vassal in exchange for cash and impunity. Massive federal transfers created a modern version of Dangalad. What tribute payments were disguised as subsidies and development aid. However, official budget data indicates the scale of this dependency. More than 90% of the region's spending comes from Moscow's coffers. The local economy cannot fund the large mosque, the palaces, the state security apparatus that is necessary. So, the Russian treasury pays protection money and in return receives loyalty and a private army. This arrangement resembles the way empires bought temporary peace from frontier warlords. Putin today is running a feudalist country. He is the czar back in Moscow, and he has the local boyars, the local princes, and he tries to keep them aligned. But in this case, Chechnya and its leader is more like one of the local warlords. They give them money, they buy their allegiance, and they try to keep them nearby. Medieval rulers paid tribute to prevent raids, just as Rome paid frontier tribes. Putin's state uses oil money and legal impunity instead of gold coins. For 2 decades, this system was sold as a triumph of order, claiming separatism was crushed. But behind this narrative, the structure remained transactional. The region stayed inside of Russia because money and weapons flowed from the center. The ruling clan stayed loyal because subsidies and protection continued. Remove or weaken that flow, and the foundations of the tribute state begin to crack. A system built on cash and fear begins to falter when the cash runs low. The mutiny showed that how fragile this truth really is. The fragility of this alliance was exposed in June 2023 during the mutiny led by Yevgeny Prigozhin. When Wagner Group columns seized Rostov-on-Don and moved toward Moscow, the security architecture of the state was tested. The regular army hesitated, and the regional elites waited to see the outcome. The strongmen's forces, marketed as the Praetorian Guard, failed to play their promised role. They moved slowly and cited logistical problems. They avoided direct confrontation with the mutineers. This hesitation signaled that the strongman's loyalty is quite conditional. Ramzan Kadyrov will not sacrifice his power base for a leader who appears to be vulnerable. But since that mutiny 2 years ago, a silent power struggle has emerged inside the security apparatus. The Kremlin has begun shifting resources to Viktor Zolotov, the head of the National Guard. Zolotov is a former personal bodyguard to the president and a longtime enforcer. But since the rebellion, the National Guard has been granted the legal authority to operate heavy weaponry. That includes tanks and artillery. These are weapons designed for conventional warfare, yet they are being deployed as part of the internal police of Russia. This indicates that the regime is preparing for internal conflict, not just foreign war. Russia is not collapsing at the edges, it is rotting at the payroll. On one side, we see that the National Guard, armed with tanks and loyal to the center. On the other side, we see a southern strongman whose loyalty is rented and whose power rests on fear. In the flow of money, if it stops, political instability will arise. These two heavily armed factions could turn on each other, and today there are more signs that they are. The Kremlin is paying to keep these two rival armies on the same territory. The revenue engine that funds this war and this loyalty, however, is seizing up. This internal standoff is requiring billions of dollars to maintain, but the economic engine that funds this tribute payment system is simply no longer sufficient. The primary source of money, oil, is simply no longer what it had been. Today, tracking data shows that there is more than 180 million barrels of Russian crude sitting in tankers at the sea. This volume represents oil that was left at port but has not yet generated any revenue. Every extra day that it sits in the sea means there's deeper discounts and higher cost. The accumulating problems for Russia at this point are becoming more and more significant. We've seen how drones have been hitting facilities in Ryazan, Saratov, and Novorossiysk. It's very clear at this point that Russia's capacity is being taken offline. The financial impact is visible, and the reports from Rosneft, they show that. Rosneft is the flagship state oil company. In the first 9 months of this year, Rosneft's net profit collapsed by nearly 80% compared to the previous year. Gas production is down, refining volumes are down, and security and logistics costs continue to rise. This constitutes a revenue shock for the federal budget. When oil giants are losing 80% of their profit, there is far less money to pay tribute to regions like Chechnya. The state must decide which bills get paid first. And today, Moscow can print rubles, but it cannot force loyalty. Debt is burning up in the Russian budget. Every day we see it is getting worse. And since the start of this year, the volume of federal loan bonds is increased in circulation by more than $60 billion worth. Charts of government borrowing show a vertical spike in 2025, far above the previous years. This debt is being financed through a circular mechanism that involves a central bank. In a recent repo auction, the Bank of Russia injected billions of dollars of liquidity into the banking sector. The commercial banks take this printed cash and use it to purchase government war bonds. This is a disguised form of printing money to fund the deficit. This strain, though, is already appearing in the regional level. Look at the Republic of Bashkortostan. It's a key oil-producing region which passed its 2025 budget with a deficit of nearly $225 million. Local officials admit that's largely because they can't afford to continue without getting subsidies from Moscow. But Moscow is borrowing at record rates just to fund its war in Ukraine. The financial institutions responsible for managing this debt are themselves showing signs of insolvency. The Credit Bank of Moscow, a systemically important lender, recently reported a net interest loss of nearly $1.2 billion. To mask this deterioration of its loans, the bank created almost $2 billion in loan loss provisions, most of it within a single quarter. The volume of overdue corporate loans at the bank surged 8 times, reaching 28% of its portfolio. But for context, a non-performing loan ratio of 28% is catastrophically high. In a stable economy, ratios above 5% trigger regulatory intervention. This signals a potential liquidity crisis in Russia's banking sector, contained only by state support and opaque rules. The population is reacting to these signals with capital flight. In the third quarter, the volume of physical cash in circulation jumped by about $6.5 billion. This is 5 times higher than the increase that we saw in the same period the previous year. Russian citizens are withdrawing funds from the banking system at an accelerating rate. This run on cash coincides with new laws granting tax authorities full access to monitor people's bank accounts. The breakdown of trust in the banking system mirrors the breakdown of trust about this war narrative. Even high-ranking officers are no longer concealing the scale of the errors. General Churchkin, his admission that this war was based on a 70% intelligence lie, confirms that the invasion was structurally flawed from day one. The regime believed it was entering into a friendly country, a country that would greet it, but instead it entered a war of attrition that it cannot afford. Today, Russia is facing incredible pressure, and for those that think that the Kremlin is firm, that it'll stay in power, it is not. In fact, today, Russia is at its least stable point that it's been in decades. Today, people inside of Russia, the leadership, they must decide whether to remain loyal to a bankrupt center or to secure their own survival. The wars of the 1990s broke the Soviet legacy and reshaped Russia's map. The current dynamic suggests that the North Caucasus could once again become the fault line that fractures the state. Ukraine is betting that the combination of military exhaustion, financial insolvency, and internal rivalry will break the regime long before any army reaches Moscow. Thank you for watching. Please help us get this word to more people so they know the truth of what's happening here in Ukraine and what's happening next door in Russia. Please like this video, subscribe to this channel, and consider becoming a channel member today. And please do also check out the first pinned comment below with the question of the day. And below it, you will notice you too can donate for the Ukrainian soldiers to get life-saving drones and other supplies. This very cold winter season, we're trying to bring them more. So please do check that out. As always, thank you for supporting Ukraine.